Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser, Professor of History and co-chair of the Master of Arts program in American History and Government here at Ashland University. Welcome to our second season of Documents in Detail, TeachingAmericanHistory.org's webinar series. In each episode, we'll do a deep dive into a single document, discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of said document, while also analyzing its impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all of which are based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. To help us begin to think about the topics of this year's seminars, we are drawing speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's extensive document database available at TAH.org. You too can participate in the discussion by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time. The subject of today's program, Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And to help discuss it this evening, we have Dr. Emily Hess, Visiting Assistant Professor of History at Ashland University, and Dr. Peter Myers, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire. Emily, Pete, welcome. I think Pete is still ironing through his problems, but we will begin in any event. How are you this evening?
I'm doing well. How are you, John?
Fantastic. So, let's dive into the material. Why is this such an important document?
Well, I think this is one of the first times that you have an African American talk about the Declaration of Independence with a framework of reform in mind. As we know, Frederick Douglass is the most accomplished African American, the most significant and influential African American of the 19th century. He goes from being enslaved to becoming a speaker on the circuit of William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society to eventually being an advisor to that of Lincoln. And so we have this self-made man who becomes extraordinarily educated and believes that the American dream is something that he can accomplish and that his brethren can accomplish if other Americans will allow them to do so. But you definitely see a connection between this and another very important document in our 50 core documents, the I Have a Dream speech. So I think this is so important because you have that voice for the first time articulating the reason why African Americans should be included in the body politic.
So it's fair to say that this is a fairly in-your-face speech. How does he go about using the occasion of the 4th of July to make his case against slavery?
Right. I like to picture this as though it's an incredibly awkward situation because he's speaking to the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York, and they approach him to talk on the 4th of July. Now, at the time, the 4th of July was celebrated in a way very different than it is today. The 4th of July then was a rather solemn experience. It was something that you celebrated, but you reflected on your nation's history, reflected on the principles and what made us distinct and being an educated citizenry. Instead, now we blow things up and we meet in tube form, right? So they're asking him to contribute on this day and to reflect on our nation's history and the beauty of it and the glory of it. And he can't believe this, right? You want me to talk about what to the slave is the 4th? Are you kidding me? Right in 1852, when my brethren are not even free. And so you can see that he doesn't give the speech on the 4th. He gives a speech on the 5th. And that is not simply because he had other arrangements on the 4th. It's because he decided not to. So that's the context of this speech, that he's willing to give a speech, but he's only willing to engage so much in the celebration, that he argues.
the attendees have had this title before them? I mean, would they? What might they have expected to hear that night?
Well, it seems as though, by the way in which I'm no scholar of remembrances of oh, I see Peter.
Either Dr. Baker has joined us, or Ray Myers is here.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Fine. Wonderful. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know exactly. I don't know what happened with that, but glad to be with everybody.
Okay. Well, we're talking about what's the same as the 4th of July, and beginning with just a rather general statement about why this is such a significant document. And I'm wondering if we've heard Emily talk about it. I'm wondering if you might share your thoughts as well on that.
Just on the general importance of it. Well, I was off fiddling with the mic, so I don't know if I'm going to duplicate anything that Emily said. But Douglass's speech is often regarded, I mean, by people who study Douglass and people who study the abolitionists as the greatest of all speeches he gave and possibly the greatest of all abolition speeches. It was... I think you probably said a couple of things about the context. Douglass was invited to speak on the occasion of the 4th of July, and in 19th century America, the 4th of July celebrations were kind of a big deal, and they were often the holiday was often commemorated by oratory. So this is Douglass, having lived in Rochester for just a few years, addressing I think it was the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester who invited him. It occurs to me to think that Emily would have been a member of that society had she been living in Rochester in the 19th century. And at any rate, Douglass goes there to speak. I'm not sure that what he said, the tone of what he said, would have been all that unexpected, but he worked on it. I mean, and at this point in his career, he's given a lot of speeches, but he says he worked on this speech for about 3 weeks before, and he was quite nervous about speaking on this occasion, and so it was one of the really the most well-crafted of I think all of Douglass's speeches.
So it's fair to say that the members of the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society were not expecting the speech that they got. Is that fair to say?
Well, I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure. I mean, it was an anti-slavery society, and Douglass at this point in his career, even though he's still a pretty young man, he's 34, he'd been out on the abolitionist circuit for, approaching 10 years, and he was a quite famous man. I mean, he had already written his first autobiography, and his second one would come in just another couple of years. He was a very famous man, and he'd been saying very harshly denunciatory things about slavery, of course, and to some extent about America also. So I'm not really sure that it would have been terribly unexpected. What Douglass said. I mean, I was going to say that the quality of it might have been somewhat unexpected, but even then, I mean, Douglass was regarded as a great orator, and so I'm not sure how much of it was really a surprise, but it was a very powerful speech nonetheless.
Okay. Emily, you have anything to add to that?
I do think that. And maybe this is how I've always envisioned it, and so Pete could be, taking away my illustration that I've created in my own head. But I always think that there's this moment where, in the speech, he asks, "Are you trying to offend me by inviting me, to give the speech that you have Margaret, right, the president of the Anti-Slavery Society, being like, I knew we shouldn't listen to Ruth," like this kind of awkward, like, ooh, that in a way. Maybe they assumed that Douglass would have approach them as friends or as allies or as, that he's preaching to the choir and rah, 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 and we agree. And instead, it seems as though he's indicting them as well, where it's not an us versus them of we in the North, we good, we anti-slavery and South bad, right? It's not this Neanderthal history, but instead, Douglass is really calling them maybe to greater action, and I think that would have maybe unsettled them a little. I think they expect the majority of it, but I'm wondering if his lack of am I making sense when I say that? His lack of maybe a graciousness of being invited and almost treating them as part of the problem they may have not expected.
That's exactly what inspired my question. I mean, as I read this, I get to this point and I start to think, it's almost like, what were you thinking in inviting me to do this? But for me, one of the most important aspects of this document is when he responds to the charge that there should be more debate and discussion on slavery, right? And he responds extremely forcefully to that suggestion. Could you say, either of you say a bit more about that?
That's a point about the abolition rhetoric. I'm trying to find the passage as I'm talking to you, but he comments on a common criticism directed especially toward the radical abolitionists, the Garrisonians, who tended to hector their fellow citizens about slavery, who tended to, I'm finding it here, who tended to call them sinners and worse, and really excoriate them. And one thinks of Lincoln as a kind of a contrast, who goes out of his way, who hated slavery in his way, but he goes out of his way to be very muted and gentle with regard to, he says at one point, Lincoln says at one point to a Northern audience, I'm not interested in vilifying Southerners, that they would be, they are exactly what we would be in their situation. And I think actually Douglass would have agreed with that point about Northerners and Southerners. I mean, that's related to the thought that Emily was expressing a minute ago. But he doesn't want any part of the suggestion that you should try to reason with slaveholders rather than provoking a more emotional response. He says, at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. He says, had I the ability, this is ironic, I think, and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke, which is pretty much what he does in that speech. And maybe to bridge the gap a little bit between what I said and what Emily said about the surprising character of Douglass's rhetoric here, there's repeatedly in this speech he addresses Americans. So when he uses the second person pronoun, which he does a lot, when he calls it your holiday and your founding fathers and your country and so forth, it's not clear exactly whom he's addressing. It's not clear that he's really, in the most important respect, talking to the Rochester Anti-Slavery Society. He's talking to the whole country on the occasion of the 4th of July. He knows this is going to be publicized, and that might be the part of the explanation, I think, for the surprising character or not. But Douglass wants slavery rebuked. I mean, to argue with it is in some sense to dignify it, although he does actually, in his way, proceed to argue with it. But that's enough for me for a while.
Okay, Emily.
Yeah, I want to add to Pete's points, which I think are very good. This emphasis on the you and on the your. I think he wants to make very clear that while this is a glorious celebration of a beautiful day, that makes this country exceptional. I'm not part of it. And so although I am free, and although I am making money off speeches, and although that, right, there are all of these things, someone has purchased my freedom, and the majority of my brethren are still enslaved. And so we are not equal at this moment. You can tell in this rhetoric that Douglass uses that he is a citizen intellectually, right? He does embrace all of the principles of the United States, and he believes this to be a beautiful and glorious thing in the way in which he talks about the Founding Fathers and the Constitution. I mean, he's all in, right? But the problem is that we're not living up to it. And so he does make if he makes a distinction between us versus them, it's not slaveholders and abolitionists, it's him and the other abolitionists. That we are not, don't get this mixed up, we are not the same. Okay. And until all men are free, right, that is something that's going to be.
Okay. Larry Fata asks, I always teach in my AP class about Douglass being a constructive critic rather than someone with animus towards the United States. He seems to criticize critics of the Constitution being he criticizes those who claim that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. He criticizes slavery Christianity, which he views as in complete opposition to true Christianity. It seems to me that he sees great promise for the United States. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, in one word, yes. In more than one word, I guess I would say ultimately yes. But Douglass's speech is interesting. I called it finely crafted a little while ago, and this is one of the things I meant by that. That Douglass here, maybe this is the best example, but it's not the only speech in which he does this. He speaks from different perspectives, and there are really at least three parts of this speech. And in the first part, he says he actually adopts the perspective of the white members of his audience, his white fellow citizens, and that's when you get this flurry of statements. This is what it looks like to you, right? And then he goes on to say, this is your Passover. This is a glorious occasion. You celebrate this. It's the birth of your national independence. And he makes a point of saying, I share your opinion about the founders and the founding. And there's a couple of passages in which he says, the founders were brave men. They were great men. They were principled. They were prudent. They were statesmen. You should imitate them. You should honor them. You should take them as your models. You should imitate them. And then he switches gears. And the second part of the speech is Douglass adopting the perspective now of the slave, the people, and more generally Black Americans, the people for whom he in particular speaks. And then he gets really, really angrily denunciatory. That you Americans, and there you get a bunch of statements directly addressing Americans with an exclamation point. You Americans claim to be, by your founding principles, the natural rights republic, and you are in fact the greatest violator of natural human rights in the world today because of slavery. And a further distinction that's pertinent in that context is he distinguishes he not only shifts perspectives between the way it looks to the whites and the way it looks to him, but he also speaks of it in terms of past and future. And he says that America's past looks good. The whites are right about America's past, meaning the founding. They are not right about America's present, which is awful in the way that he says all of the nation's major institutions, political and religious, are dominated by the slave power, and obviously that's a horrible thing. This is the way it looks to us, and you get to the very brink of thinking that this starts to look like a Black nationalist speech in part. That we are a separate people, a colonized people, In parts it isn't entirely clear why he thinks that Black Americans really can get along in the United States. And that's a lead up to the third part, but again, I'm talking too much, and so I'd be interested whatever Emily wants to add to that or subtract from that.
No, certainly. I think before he reads his speech, before he gives his speech, he reads the Declaration, right? So it's abundantly clear that he agrees with the principles, but not with the conduct, right? That if this is such a glorious document, if this is such a wonderful country and principles, instead of simply celebrating it, how about you do it as well, right? Instead of simply going to this one room and glorifying and saying, this is great, look what our founding fathers did, aren't they amazing? I think part of Douglass's speech is trying to say, yeah, it was. Now let's actually live up to that. It reminds me of the social gospel in a way of during the progressive era when they say, yeah, you shouldn't just, talk about Jesus, but you should act accordingly as well and really live up to that. But Pete had mentioned that area when he had this admiration for the founders, and he concludes that statement by saying they love their country better than their own private interests. And then we begin discussing how they were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to the people's submission to bondage. And I think he makes that connection of abolitionists and anti-slavery men as being in a similar accord, because it's clear, as Douglass says, looking back now, to see that they were indeed correct, the founding fathers. But at the time, there were many loyalists who thought they were absolutely crazy. And so in a similar vein, right, we are attempting to follow the way of the founders, but haven't gotten to that ultimate point yet. But yeah, the problem is not the principles. The problem is the conduct.
One further thing to add just on that point, the questioner made reference to, to religion as well as to politics and the Constitution. And it's one of my favorite passages in this speech, which is really full of biblical references. When it's in the very early part of the section on the present, when Douglass says, it was fashionable hundreds of years ago for the children of Jacob to boast, we have Abraham to our father, when they had long lost Abraham's faith and spirit. That people contented themselves under the shadow of Abraham's great name while they repudiated the deeds that made his name great. Need I remind you, a similar thing is being done all over this country today. And he goes on a bit. Washington could not die till he had broken the chains of his slaves, yet his monument is built up by the price of human blood, and the traitors in the bodies and souls of men shout, we have Washington to our father. When you track down the biblical reference of that, the figure in the Bible, I mean, it could be more than one, but I think the main figure in the Bible who makes this denunciation of the present generation that claims Abraham to their father, even as they betray Abraham's principles, is John the Baptist. Douglass is positioning himself kind of in the person of John the Baptist, warning, so to speak, a present generation of vipers, that they're going to be baptized by blood and fire also, that woe unto them, and so forth. And that's his way of saying also that you're betraying what's basically the nation's religion as well as its civil religion or its politics.
First, I want to let everyone know out there we've got there's plenty of time for any questions that you might ask. Use the chat function. I want to refer your attention to, well, this is the first page on my printout. Your mileage may vary. But this is the fourth paragraph of the document. He's commenting on the youth of the United States. And he says, you are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. The eye of the reformer is met with angry flashes, pretending disastrous times, but his heart may well beat lighter at the thought that America is young, and that she is still in the impressible stage of her existence. May he not hope that high lessons of wisdom, of justice, and of truth will yet give direction to her destiny? And he goes on in this vein. My question to both of you is, how optimistic is Douglass about the ability to, about the future of slavery?
Emily, you go ahead. No, that's a really good question. I got a lot to say about that, but so Emily, you start.
I would argue personally that I believe he's incredibly optimistic, and not just from this speech, but if you read his speech after the Dred Scott decision, which is maybe I can't imagine much more of a blow to the abolitionist movement or civil rights movement, where Roger Taney says that African Americans were never supposed to be included in the Constitution or in the Declaration, and the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. And so I think that Douglass maintained significant confidence because of the principles and because of our youth. And as we well know, I visit my dear Mimi, my grandmother in Boca Raton, at least once a year. And if you try and get her to even change an ounce of her morning routine, you are the most blasphemous human being on the planet. Whereas if you offer suggestion maybe to a 7-year-old, and they're all in an automatic. And I tell my students that oftentimes when your younger siblings get in trouble, right? Or when you try and get them in trouble and say, Mom, Dad, what about them? What's the pen? And they'll oftentimes say they're so young, they don't know any better, right? They don't know any better. And so I'd like to think that these are times, Douglass is arguing that, number one, the more we talk about slavery, the issue of slavery, it doesn't become more settled, it becomes less settled, right? We continue to speak of this. I think he's done that in the Dred Scott decision. So that's helpful. But then the other component of this is the framework is correct. And it's only in this country where we've actually established that all men are created equal. And so this is the best vehicle. Douglass believes that this country and the government framework is the appropriate vehicle for emancipation, whereas Garrison would say, we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and this is impossible because we'd start with the wrong thing. I think he gives a speech in 1860 talking about the Constitution and saying that there's nothing wrong with it. Instead, people are misreading it. In the same way as back in the time of when T-Rexes roamed the earth and we had to look at paper maps for guidance. If you accidentally end up in Nebraska when you should have been in Florida, it's not the map's fault, but instead it's actually the fact that you're not able to read it. That was an incident from my youth and my mother and father yelling at one another. But yeah, so long story short, I would argue that Douglass is incredibly optimistic, and he even says at the end of this document he gets encouragement from the Declaration.
I agree with all of that. And I would add a little bit. Douglass was characteristically a very hopeful man, and so you find, irrepressibly hopeful, really. And so it's a common thing in a lot of Douglass's speeches. And a lot of his speeches are kind of dark and angry. Both in the antebellum period and then in the later, especially the last couple of decades of his life. But they never end in a dark and angry way. They never end on a note of pessimism. They always end on a note of hopefulness, which is not exactly the same thing as optimism, but he really was, I think, optimistic. And he was optimistic, as he says. That was, by the way, the third section of the speech when I was talking about the division into the three sections. That's the third section when he says that, allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I've presented, I don't despair of the country. And there are commentators on Douglass who think that this is largely a theological thing, that Douglass is, and he says things to that effect every once in a while, and I think in the Dred Scott speech he says, arm of the Lord is not shortened. The powers of Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, are great, but they're not divine powers. There's something to that, but I think that that's not really the basic explanation of Douglass's optimism. Douglass believed he had reasons to think that the demise of slavery was imminent. When he gave this speech in 1852, he's kicking around some ideas that get developed a little bit later on in the course of the decade of the 1850s. Here, he talks about the spirit of the age as well, and there's something interesting in that. He says that, first and foremost, I'm optimistic for the reason Emily mentioned. The founding principles are good, and the country dedicated itself to them, and that's got to mean something. One could respond to that. Okay, well, does it really have to mean something? You just got done saying that those principles have been betrayed. What's to make us believe that they're not just going to continue to be betrayed? And so he makes this point about the spirit of the age, and it's a kind of a technological point. He says there's a communications revolution going on. So he goes on and says nations don't now stand in the same relation to each other they did ages ago. No nation can shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot round in the same old path of its fathers without interference. He goes on in that way. Knowledge was then confined and enjoyed by a privileged few. The multitude walked in mental darkness. A change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Well, here's, I think, what he means by that. He says again and again, in his autobiographies especially, My Bondage and My Freedom is really good on this, that slavery requires seclusion to survive. Slavery can't withstand really open discussion, and the behavior of the slaveholders at the South would seem to corroborate that because they suppress abolitionist speech. And so Douglass is suggesting that in a way, something like Thomas Paine suggested around the time of the American Revolution. Douglass is a lot like Thomas Paine in some respects. Thomas Paine says this theory of natural rights is revolving around the world and it will prove irresistible. And I think that's what Douglass thinks also, that more and more, these doctrines are going to spread because they're true. And as they spread, the slaveholders in the American South are going to feel themselves more and more confined and under greater and greater pressure. People are always creatures of a desire for a good reputation. Slaveholders are not immune to that. And that's going to have a powerful effect. There are other reasons, especially noted in that Dred Scott speech, as to why Douglass thinks the law of nature is on his side and supports his optimism, but maybe those can come out as we get further into our discussion.
Peter, as from that same paragraph you were just quoting from, I read, walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. And I, as soon as I read it, I thought, that sounds familiar to me. And just now, I remember where I saw something very similar to that. And it was in Marx's Communist Manifesto, where in fact he is praising bourgeois society for saying that trade has knocked down the Chinese walls, right, and is in fact civilizing the world. This leads me to a question. Now, I think it would be silly to ask if Douglass was a Marxist. I think the answer is obviously no. But is there any evidence that he read Marx at all and had any impression of it?
Not that I know of. I don't know of anything in Douglass's writing or speaking where he ever references Marx. He did read Tocqueville. He did read a lot. So I can't say no definitely. He was certainly aware of socialism, which some of the abolitionists were also socialists, and he took a quite dim view, actually, of socialism. So I don't know that he would have been terribly sympathetic to Marx, but I do think, the comparison is apt in a way first of all, they kind of look alike as Douglass gets older, but more substantively than that, the comparison is apt in a way because Douglass's thinking, in some sense, does have this sense that that there's a law of nature. There's a kind of Hegelianism about Douglass, and he did read. I don't know if he had read up to this point, but he fell in with this German emigre woman who got him to read some of the acolytes of Hegel, Feuerbach, and I can't remember if it was Fichte. At any rate, he did read some of that stuff, and so he did have in his head some of the 19th century German idea that history has a direction and it's moving toward the revelation of freedom. So if you take Marx's thought and you just lop off the communist revolution and you think the bourgeois revolution is the final one, I think that would come pretty close to what Douglass thinks, actually.
Yeah. Emily, you have anything to add on this?
No, I know nothing about Douglass and Marx, actually, so I'll keep that one to Peter's comment.
Yeah, it struck me because Communist Manifesto came out in 1848, which is just 4 years before he gave this speech, and it was something of a sensation. I would frankly be surprised if he hadn't been aware of it.
Well, you may be. Let me jump in really quickly about that. You may be right. As I'm thinking about that, Douglass was very attentive to what was going on in Europe, and he was also very enthusiastic in 1848 about this wave of revolutionary activity in Europe. And he may very well have read Marx in that connection, but he doesn't ever mention him.
Yeah, and something else I found striking is and gets to your point about Douglass's optimism. As he said, this is a country where revolutionary leaders from Europe can come here and be celebrated from one end of the country to another. Right? Americans are not unfeeling about the cause of liberty elsewhere. So as soon as they figure out that the worst abuses of liberty in the world right now are happening right here, and they will figure that out, then that will be fixed. Yeah. Let me go and see if anyone. No, apparently no other questions. Well, let me ask this: what do you know about the reception of this speech? We said before this may not have been exactly the kind of speech that the ladies in attendance would have been expecting. Obviously they expected to hear denunciations of slavery, but perhaps did not expect to be made to feel uncomfortable themselves. Was there how was this? And you say this speech was given so as to be publicized elsewhere. So Douglass understood it wasn't going to be just these ladies in Rochester listening. What was the reaction in the press and elsewhere to this speech?
On that one, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say. Actually, I don't know that much about what the reaction was. Emily, I would guess, probably knows more about that than I do.
Well, Pete, I was actually going to say that John and I were talking about this earlier, and I'm like, well, that's going to be Pete's question. My knee-jerk reaction is to think, because we both haven't read all that much about any sort of strong reaction, that must mean that this was an abolitionist speech that was expected from Douglass. And if people know Douglass, they know that this is his rhetoric and this is how he gives speeches and this is his MO. And so while it may be slightly extreme, it still falls in line with what people are used to from Douglass. I mean, that's the only thing that I can think of, because if people aren't necessarily writing these diatribes against him, then this may have been a run-of-the-mill speech for him, though it obviously is a very eloquent and as you mentioned, well-crafted speech. People don't seem to be looking for the presses where this was printed and lighting it on fire.
Here's an additional thought that comes to me just now, and this is a kind of a half-educated guess, so this is nothing authoritative on my part, but it is true that the abolitionists are really a quite small minority in American politics. I mean, the abolitionists are obviously hated at the South, but they're almost as vigorously hated by most Northerners. They're very, very unpopular. And so it may be that the abolitionists are something of an echo chamber. I mean, Douglas's speeches were often were reported on in newspapers, sometimes reprinted in newspapers, but the newspapers would have been friendly to the abolition cause, more or less. And so I'm not, Douglass was well known, but I'm not sure that any speech given by any abolitionist is going to create a big national sensation. I mean, even when Garrison starts calling for the dismemberment of the country, it's not clear that that got a great big national reaction either. So it may be that that the rest of the country thinks, well, that's this is more of the same from these radical abolitionists, without paying a whole lot of attention to the details.
I actually, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish.
The only abolitionist that I can really think of where the United States as a whole responded strongly was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and some of the Southern reviews of that, and giving her the biggest insult of calling her a man, not to know if she's a true woman, right? So that's the only really piece of abolitionist literature that I can think of that has this strong rebuke outside the abolitionist circle.
Yeah, and that's ambiguous too. I mean, it's certainly abolitionist, but it's also, at least a lot of people thought, arguably colonizationist, which makes it a little bit more mainstream. And it isn't, it's much more sentimental than the speech that the kind of fiery speech that Douglass wants. I don't know whether that has anything to do, and it's also literature. I mean, people read stories more than Douglass's autobiographies were big sellers, the first two of them. I don't know, how that really translates into the reception to his speeches.
Now, his writings and his speeches simply did not circulate in the South. Did Southerners know who he was? Yes.
They knew who he was. That's part of the story of the first autobiography. They knew who he was. Well, he says in his autobiographies that slaveholders paid attention to the abolitionists. They were afraid of the abolitionists. That they prevented abolitionist literature from circulating in the mails. But I think they read the paper. I mean, I think they had sources that kept them informed as to what the abolitionists were up to. That's part of it. Another part is that when what prompted Douglass to write his first autobiography, as you guys know, were doubts that arose fairly quickly after he started speaking as an itinerant Garrisonian speaker. Doubts arose pretty quickly that he was telling the truth, because he was such a good orator. He was such an able, articulate speaker that people were saying, this guy couldn't possibly have been a slave. This is a setup. This guy was educated somewhere in the North. And Douglass had been vague up to that point about identifying actually where he was from, who his slave owners were, and so forth, because he was a fugitive. He didn't want them on his trail, so he had to be vague about that. Then these doubts start arising that are going to prevent him from doing his job for the Garrisonians, and so he decides to write his autobiography. And now I'm going to name names. I'm going to tell you exactly who owned me and exactly things that happened. And he did that, and the narrative was a big bestseller very quickly. Sold tens of thousands of copies within weeks, I think. And so Douglass became notorious in that respect, and was widely known at the South as well as the North.
Mm-hmm. Emily, anything, gentlemen?
the only thing I'll say is that I think one of the most interesting components is because he writes that he has to go to Europe, right? Because he's given all of this very specific information, and now he's essentially created this warrant out for him, and he becomes friends with abolitionists in Britain, and they're the ones that end up purchasing his freedom. And of course, Garrison is very critical of this. And how can you acknowledge that your property, right? And Douglass basically says, how can you act as though you know what it's like to be enslaved and on the run? But I think that's the beginning of the end for them. So it's the story behind the narrative and why it even had to be written, I think, shows a lot of complexity in the abolitionist movement and the way in which African Americans were viewed. Just because some abolitionists did not want them to be enslaved does not necessarily mean that all abolitionists believed in the full equality of the black man.
Now, I'd like to ask more about Douglass's relationship to the Garrisonians. In his Glasgow speech of 1860, he obviously is spending most of his time defending the Constitution. Toward the end of it, he says, "There was a time when I had newly run away that I was very taken with the Garrisonian interpretation of the Constitution, but I was young and foolish, and since then my reading has changed." When was it that the scales fell away from his eyes, so to speak? And what was there anything in particular that happened to him that caused him to see things differently?
Emily, you know that story. You want to go ahead?
I was going to say, you go ahead, Pete. I'll chime in.
Okay. Was there any single great event? I'm not certain about that, but here's the way he explains it in the second autobiography, which is published in 1855, and so it contains his account of his break with the Garrisonians. He says that the decisive thing what begins the decisive thing, I guess, is that he becomes a newspaper editor, and which is something that Garrison, who was, of course, himself a newspaper editor, who ran the Liberator, which is the most prominent of the abolition newspapers, Garrison advised him not to do. And Douglass was not, he said, there's some reason for advising me not to do this, but he was a little suspicious of Garrison's motives. But at any rate, what he says is that being an editor forced me to consider different points of view, because I wanted to run a paper that would be open to different points of view with regard to abolitionism. And so I started to consider arguments of those who become known as the political abolitionists, and they seemed persuasive to me. Now, it's hard to figure out. People argue about this, disagree about this. It's hard to figure out whether Douglass got persuaded as to the anti-slavery character of the Constitution for constitutional interpretation reasons, as opposed to reasons of pragmatic politics. That is, he thought, it's certainly true that he thought the Garrisonians' denunciation of the Constitution, and therefore much of the founding, was a radical error. I mean, was going to isolate the abolitionists from the whole rest of the country, was going to make them really deeply unpopular. And so this is a big error with regard to its prudential significance. Whether that's the consideration, he says, look, I mean, do we want to say that we have to overturn the Union in order to fight the slaveholders? This is a little too much to take on, It would be much better to have the Union on our side. So there is that incentive. But that said, Douglass was conscientious, and he read a lot of argumentation about the Constitution, and he makes very carefully crafted arguments about how to interpret the Constitution. The most developed of them are in that speech, the Glasgow speech. Trying to spin out his thinking on the Constitution is kind of an interesting exercise. I think he makes a formidable argument.
Emily?
I think the only other thing I'd add, and I appreciate Peter's summary of that, it was very good that I agree there wasn't any particular moment necessarily where this is the time, but it did become clear that once he starts the North Star newspaper that he does need to weigh both sides. And the way in which I think of Douglass looking at Garrison is almost the way some of our undergraduates will look at us the first semester of the year like, wow, you wise sage, and then by their senior year, they're questioning all of your arguments, coming up with really awesome ideas. But I think at one time Douglass called Garrison a walking university. I could be wrong on that, but I believe that's what he had said, and so he just learned so much from him. But that was the first person that he had come in contact with that had that same sort of passion and access and power as an abolitionist. And so, of course, he admired him and he praised him. And then once I think he started to develop his own ideas, right, that he could see maybe some of the problems with them. I think the final blow in their relationship, or as far as them seeing eye to eye, I mean, the Constitution is the most important, but also Douglass does not believe in the pacifism of Garrison, and he will not join John Brown, but he also does not condemn John Brown. And then the coming of the Civil War, he considers this to be a jubilee, that if there was going to be any reconciliation, which that there won't, but it's certainly not going to happen any longer.
That's a very good point. Just a small thing to add in that connection. Douglass met John Brown in 1847, and John Brown was already, trying strenuously to persuade him that slavery will not be abolished by means of moral suasion, that slavery will have to be abolished by force. And if you think about it, that really was the implication even of the constitutional route to abolishing slavery, right? You're trying to elect, even if you start with the idea that the Constitution is anti-slavery. That will mean nothing unless you can elect a governing majority in the Congress and in the presidency that will, in fact, act to abolish slavery. Now, Douglass was not naive. He knew that it was unlikely you're going to get that majority, but if you did, and they actually did enact such a law, he knows what the consequence of that's going to be. It's going to be civil war. It's not going to be peaceful abolition. So whether it's done by law or whether it's done by arms, is going to be done by arms anyway. And John Brown has basically persuaded him of that. And so he becomes, in a certain sense, in the 1850s, he becomes more political and more radical at the same time.
Okay, well, we are out of time, so we will let that be the last word. I want to thank both of our panelists, Emily, Pete, for their insights. Just a reminder to all of you about the email you'll be receiving with a link for a certificate of participation. Look for that in your inboxes. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center, which are also offered as part of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. You can help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you will be receiving by email next week. Share that with your colleagues as well as on social media. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be Wednesday, December 13th, when our subject will be Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. At that time, I'll be joined by Dr. Dan Monroe of Millikan University and Dr. Jonathan White of Christopher Newport University. The recommended readings for that webinar have already been posted, so we hope to see you back here on December 13th. Good night.